All right. Today we are going to focus on a really fun technique that is a little bit of a twist on maybe what some of us have done with watercolor paper and with using water and ink to get some images. And today is focused more on the technique. I will talk about how I finished off this card, but I'm really focusing on how to get the ink and the images down on this particular project here. So what I am really, again, focused on is to try and make sure that everybody has the opportunity to learn the technique. I really love the Hand-Penned Petals Stamp Set. And you will notice as we go through that there are several of the stamps that are used on this card. One of them is the outline stamp, which is shown on the case on the bottom right. And then to fill in the colors of that outline stamp and to add a little bit more around the edges, I used quite a few of what we would normally call the kind of two-step fill-in stamps, the ones that are solid. I think the best way to show you this is literally to show you. And what I'm going to start with, I will recreate this. This is a piece of watercolor paper. It measures 3 3/4 by 5. The reason it is 3 3/4 by 5 is I wanted to have a border around a standard A2 size. And we know A2 is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. So I took 1/2 inch off each side. So 4 1/4, took off 1/2 inch to get to 3 3/4, 5 1/2, I took off 1/2 inch to get to 5. And what I ended up doing is I used my Stamparatus. Haven't used this in a little while, so it had a little dust that I needed to get off the Stamparatus. And I have this set up, so I'm just going to do this really quickly. And because I will be doing some watercoloring, I need to concern myself with the kind of ink that I'm going to use to stamp the flowers. It needs to be an ink that is not going to react when I put my watercolor paper, and especially when I start doing the watercoloring itself. So a couple of kinds of ink that you can use. One is StazOn, and I would show you my StazOn pad, but let me tell you an embarrassing truth. When I got my StazOn pad out, because I was going to use that to ink up this image, it was really dry. So that was not going to work. So another option that you may have in your stash, I have some VersaFine. This is a really nice ink that does really well with a lot of different techniques, and it does really well with watercoloring as well. So I'm going to use the VersaFine. And what I'm going to do for this is you will notice that the image, which is this image right here, is going to be stamped on the top. Then we're going to turn it over and we're going to stamp it again on the bottom. What is not really easy to see necessarily is that that stamp goes a little bit beyond midway in terms of where it would actually have the image. I don't want it to do that. So I'm going to mask off just a little bit when I put my paper in to stamp. One thing about watercolor paper, you've got two sides. One is a little smoother than the other. It's really up to you. If I'm going to be doing stamping on watercolor paper, I usually will turn the paper to the smooth side because I just want to try, and I say try, to get as good an image as I can. And one way to do that is to have some of the ridges kind of taken out. So I'm going to use the smooth side. I'm masking the middle and I'm sort of eyeballing it. If you want to get really crazy, you can get a ruler out at 5 inches, you would just put a little pencil mark at 2.5. The side is going to get covered up with the final way that at least I did this card. So if I've got a pencil mark under there, no one is going to know. And then I'm just going to make sure that I can bring everything over and stamp that. So I'm going to go ahead and ink this up with some VersaFine. And I do, like I said, I really do like this ink. It is very, very good, especially if you do have some smaller lines in your stamp. It does exactly what it says. It's for VersaFine. It's a nice ink for some very fine lines. And that looks pretty good. So then what I will do is I'm just going to flip my paper 180 degrees, put it back in the Stamparatus. I will caution you that you don't want to put that same edge up where you had the original, because you may see some ink bleeding through. So just revolve it, take it about 90 degrees, put it back where you had the paper initially. It's just a little bit of a safeguard. I found that when I did it the first time that I did get a little bit of bleed through, and that is not what I wanted. And then I'm just going to stamp the same image on the other side. Obviously, this doesn't look like a mirror because the image is focused more on one side than it is on the other. And there we have it. So this will be the focal point that I'm going to use to create the card. I can put the Stamparatus away. I am not going to need that. The rest of the stamping is going to be done with blocks, stamps, and ink. So you're going to do some kind of free form, and this is where the fun comes in. So I am just going to put my VersaFine ink to the side. Let me show you again the final card, and then I'm going to come back in and do the technique. You're going to see that in this card, I have used all of the new in colors: the polished pink, the pale papaya, the fresh freesia, the evening evergreen, and the soft succulent. And I am going to start with a stamp that is going to fill in the biggest part of the stamp that I just did. And that is this stamp right down here. It's kind of a distinctive stamp. It has a lot of different levels of intensity. And I just put that onto my block. So let me tell you what I'm going to do, and then I will do it. I am going to first stamp the image in fresh freesia. So obviously that ink is going to be on this image. Then what I am going to do is I'm going to use a dauber, and I am going to get some of the polished pink ink on the dauber, and I'm going to use that dauber and go around the outside of the image. And I am going to squirt said image with some water. This is just a little distress sprayer that I have. Anything that missed water, you're going to be fine. And this is going to get nice and wet. And then I'm going to take that wet stamp, turn it over, and stamp it onto the watercolor paper. And since the watercolor paper works super well with water, it is going to do some really fun things and disperse the color. I'm just going to get these two ink pads kind of set up because I will be playing with both of them. And I do suggest that if you have a dauber or a sponge or whatever it may be, that you kind of dedicate a dauber to a color or a color family. This works a little bit better. The other thing that I have handy, paper towels, because I want to make sure that I can clean off my stamps. So let's just do this. Here's my stamp. I'm going to ink that up. I've got my fresh freesia, however you say it, on that stamp. I am now going to get a little bit of polished pink onto my dauber. And I'm going to take that and I'm just going to go right around the edges. Don't overthink this. It really is not scientific. So I'm just kind of going around there. I'm going to take that dauber, put it aside. Then off camera, because I don't want to squirt onto my ink pads, I'm going to squirt the water onto my stamp. And you can now see that that's nice and wet. And then I am going to take that stamp, turn it over, align it where the image is, and I'm going to set that down. Just going to let that sit for a couple of seconds, because what's happening is that watercolor paper is absorbing the color. I'm going to let that sort of settle and do its own little thing for a minute. And I'm going to wipe off my stamp with my paper towel and get the ink off. And I'm going to turn this around and do the exact same thing. So, stamping up my stamp with the base color. I do want to kind of get ink off of the dauber before I go back in and get more of that polished pink, because I may have some of the fresh freesia on my dauber and I don't want to contaminate the pink. So I'm just rubbing that off a little bit. I'm going to go back in, get some pink, and I'm going to go around the outside. It's still a little wet because of the fact that I didn't get everything dried off. That's not an issue, don't worry about it. And I'm going to off camera squirt a couple times so that I do have some water on my block and on the ink. And again, I am going to go right over that image and just kind of press it down a little bit. And then bring it up. And I don't care that it didn't quite fill in the way I wanted. And what's kind of cool is I also have a second generation of the ink on here. And I can go right back. This is the first one that I did. I can go right back and just add a little bit of color there. And I can add some more color later if I want. Once this dries, you can go back and you can add in a second layer, and it is going to work incredibly well. So you can continue to layer this if you want, but you're going to see that over time as it dries, it's going to kind of spread the color a little bit more. The next flower that I'm going to do is I'm going to move to the smaller one in the image. It's down from the top, it's on the bottom right. I am going to use the polished pink again to do the edge, but this time I'm going to use the Kale Papaya as the primary color. And for this stamp, I'm going to use the one that fills in that flower, which is this one right here. All right, so it's the exact same process, just different colors. So I'm just going to open up my Kale Papaya, and I will add some Kale Papaya to that stamp. Move these down just a little bit. I think that was a little off camera, my apologies. So adding some Kale Papaya. Again, I'm just going to get that ink off of my dauber, but I will get some of the polished pink, go around the edge, and squirt a little bit of water. And then just make sure I know the orientation of the stamp. Hold on. Yeah, that looks right. All right. And then I'm going to go in and hold that down and just let the ink kind of do its thing. And you can really see how that one is definitely a two-tone, and I can go back in and I can add that second generation. And then I'm going to come back in on the other side, clean that off just a tad. Go back in, get some more of the Kale Papaya. There's Freesia on the outside. Squirt it a little bit. You only need a couple of squirts. You don't need a whole lot. And then I'm just going to hold that right over the image and let it settle in. And then I can come back. Now what's kind of cool too is you can also do this. This is another way, another trick. You can in and you can grab just a little bit of the Kale Papaya, and don't even worry about whether you have the water on here or not. You can just go straight down and add a little bit more color if you want, because that is also going to work with the colors that you already put onto your paper. So it's really starting to fill in some of that color. Moving into the leaves are going to be done just a little differently, not super differently. And the only difference with the leaves is we are not going to put a base color. The only thing we're going to do on the leaves is we're going to use a dauber. And the dauber this time is going to be with the Evening Evergreen. And the reason is that the leaves look really kind of cool if you have more of an outline than a filled color. And I'll show you what I mean. So in the stamp set, you've got two different kinds of leaves, two different sizes. And they are this one and this one, so the larger and the smaller. And all I'm going to do on this, I am going to squirt them with water, but I'm not going to add a whole lot of color. I'm going to use the larger one first, and I'm going to use the larger one on these two leaves. And on the smaller leaf, I'll use the other stamp. And for this, all I'm going to do is I'm going to use my dauber, go in and get some ink, and I'm just going to go around the outside of the leaf. If you get more in the middle than you want, don't worry about it because it's going to blend anyway. It's just fine. So I put that on the outside. I'm going to squirt that off camera. And then you can see that that ink is already starting to sort of fill in the image. And I'm just going to put that right over the leaf. Give it a nice little push. And a lot of that green has already gone in because it is already starting to work on the stamp itself. Go back in. I'm not even going to bother to clean this one off because I'm just working with one color. So this one's a little quicker. I'm going to squirt that again and then come back in and just add a little bit of color on that. And it looks really cool. I don't know that on camera it looks as neat as it does in person. A lot of different layers of the color, a lot of different intensities, and even the way that the ink is playing is kind of fun. So going back in, do the same thing again, squirting it, and then I'm going to come up, add that color, and I'm going to do it one more time. And don't worry if the color isn't completely covering the area that you want it to. I'm going to show you a trick on that in a second. So now I'm going to come back in and I'm just going to add that color again. Now I've got secondary ink in here, so I can go in and add more color. I just added a little more color to that first leaf. So that looks a little bit more filled in. And I'm going to go ahead and just set that one down on my paper towel. And I'm going to do my middle leaf exactly the same way. So right around the outside, squirt it, and come in. And this is right below the flower. So I don't want a really big leaf because I might get the colors kind of combining where I don't want them to. And I'm going to go back in, do the same thing on the other one, and just add some color. I've got some secondary second generation ink, and I've got this fun little piece right under the flower where the petals initially were. I'm just adding a little bit of color in there. And if I wanted to add a little more, just put a little bit of ink on from my dauber and go back and just add a little bit of color on there. So I've got my color. Then you do have a few stems. And what I have here is one of the Stampin' Write markers. And I'm going to use the narrower end. And I'm just going to put a little bit of ink. I'm not making this perfect because nothing else on here looks perfect. So I just want that to have a little bit of green in there so that it all looks like it's the same. And I purposely chose the soft succulent because I wanted this to be just a little bit lighter. All right, so that's the first stage, and that being using that watercolor technique to go in and add color into the area that is within the stamped image. Now, if you're brave, here's a fun thing to do. If you're not brave, no worries. But what you can do is you can now squirt this entire thing. And what will happen is a lot of the colors are going to meld even more. You don't want to oversaturate it. So I am just going to use a little bit of water, and I'm sort of keeping this straight, but I'm also going to allow the colors to move just a little bit. It's not oversaturated, and you can see that the colors are just moving a touch, and it's kind of starting to blend a little more. And that's where that imperfection in watercolor, you are managing it, but you're allowing it to do what it wants to do. And don't overthink it, turn it around a little bit, and then just let it go. This paper is going to still be a little bit wet, and you don't want it saturated for the next step that we're going to do. So I am going to take a paper towel, and I'm just going to gently, I don't want to dab off all the water. I'm just going to very gently get some of that water off. Again, I don't want all the water to be gone. And you're going to see there's a little bit of ink on my paper towel. The next thing that I'm going to do, and this is where it is really kind of freehand. You're going to notice on this card that there are some additional images that have been added outside the lines, and they're in the shape of flowers. They're also the same color combinations that were used to color the large flower and then to add the smaller flower. The way that I'm going to do that is there are 2 more stamps in the set, and I am going to use these kind of freehand. I'm going to use the larger flower, and I'm going to use the double flower. I'm going to start with the larger flower. The reason is I want to use that first to gauge where I will have additional space available for the smaller flower. And it will also help me to kind of place where they're going to go. We're going to do pretty much the same thing that we did to start with. And what I mean by that is I am going to, on the larger stamp, I'm going to mimic the colors that I did on the first flower. So the fresh freesia and the polished pink. And it's really the same process. It's just you don't have a stamp outline. You're going to figure out where you want this to go. And I just put that into the fresh freesia. I'm going to grab the dauber that I use with the polished pink. I'll just make sure that I don't have any stray fresh freesia on there. I'm going to go ahead and do like I did before and go around the edges. And then I am going to squirt a couple of times. And now I am going to kind of figure out where do I want it. And if there's no rhyme or reason, there's nothing that's good, bad, or indifferent. And I'm just going to place that onto the watercolor paper. It doesn't even have to be completely on the watercolor. And then what's really fun about this is, you know, it's a flower image, but it doesn't have real definition. And then before I do my next image with the same thing, I just blotted that off a little bit on my paper towel. I'm going to come back in. I'm going to do that again in a fresh freesia. And I'm going to grab some more of this polished pink and squirt. And then, oh, I don't know, maybe I'll do it sort of down in here. And just let that ink do its thing for a minute and lift it. And because I also wet my entire paper, the watercolor paper is really absorbing the ink and really doing some fun things. And it shows the different hues of the color that I have going on. I'm just going to do a few more of these just to make sure that I have a couple on the side of the card. And as you can see, I'm following the same process. Once you get this going, it's really not a time-consuming one. It just, you kind of get used to how the inks are going to play together. And that one is kind of fun. It definitely is very abstract. So what I can do is go back in if I want and just give it a little bit more color and see what happens. That's kind of fun. I'm going to use the second generation ink on this side and just see what it does. That's half the fun of this, is seeing what the watercolor does. And then if I don't think that's dark enough, I'm just going to layer a little bit of the fresh freesia right on top. I am not even going to go in with a polished pink. So I'm just giving it a little bit more color. Nothing mystical, nothing magical. Now I'm going to switch to the double flower. And this is where I've got the color combination that I had with the Kale Papaya and the polished pink. And again, we're doing kind of the same thing. So it is a very simple process. This can also be done on any kind of solid image that you have. If you've got a heart stamp, or maybe a circle, a triangle, anything like that that has a pretty defined shape that people will be able to recognize if you don't have a stamp that you are filling in. And it's really kind of cool because you can put the color down and then you can let it dry. You can come back in if you want to add more color, or you can stamp over it with a grungy kind of stamp if you want to. I really like this Pale Papaya and polished pink combination. I think it's super fun. And it's just, you can definitely see the layers in the color. And you can really see where the two colors come together and give a really nice blended color. Also make sure when you're doing this that you change the direction of a stamp if you're using that stamp multiple times. So it looks like it's a different image, or it doesn't draw the person's attention to that image too fast. I made sure that those flowers were oriented just a little bit differently. And I'm just going to go back in, grab some Kale Papaya. Let's see what this looks like if I just stamp it right down in there. And I'll probably go back in and just add a little bit of the polished pink as well. And you can keep doing this until you are happy with how the colors look and how they're blending together. Don't be afraid to leave some white space around your image, because white space, especially when you're working with something like this, is good. It's pleasing to the eye. It is something that it is really nice to have so that you are not looking too much color. So I'm almost done. I think I may put just a little bit of the fresh Asia. I may do just a little half one here and a half one or something down at the bottom. And then I'm going to be done because I don't want to overdo this. And then what we're going to do is finish off this piece, and I will talk to you about how I finished the card, what I actually did with the rest of the card. So I just brought in that bigger solid stamp, and I stamped that in fresh freesia. I'm bringing back in some of the polished pink, swirling like we've done a lot already. And I don't want a lot down in here. I just want a touch. So I'm just going to put a little bit of an image down there. And then I may try and do part of an image up in here. Just want to sort of work the corners in. And I'm going to switch back to that Kale Papaya. Do a little bit more with the small one. And I'm just going to do half an image right there. All right. So again, I wanted to leave some white space, and every time you do this, you're going to come up with a slightly different design just because you're doing it freehand, unless you really do want to try and mimic the design that you've done before, which obviously is easy enough to do. So let's look at these two pieces. The one on the left is the one that is done. The one on the right is the one that we just got working on. And let's talk about what other things I did in terms of getting from the one on the right to the one on the left. And it's pretty basic. The one on the left is dry. These don't take a lot of time to dry. They do take a couple of minutes. If you are impatient, you can grab your heat gun and you can definitely speed up the process of getting this dry. Just put some good heat on it and allow it to dry. If you do the heat gun, use the heat on the top and on the bottom, because with the multiple layers of kind of paper in here, you're going to have a little bit of wetness on the bottom as well as on the top. So just go ahead and you can dry that up. Then if you want, and I'm not sure how well this is showing on camera, but I put some texture on here. I used a now retired, I apologize, but a now retired embossing folder. This is the subtle embossing folder. It gave just a nice little finish. I wanted it to look almost like a fabric. So I ran it through that embossing folder. And what I find is if you put a piece of watercolor paper through an embossing folder, it helps that watercolor paper to lie flat. We've done a lot to this piece, and in order to get it to lie flat, you have to be a little convincing. And if you run it through an embossing folder, that definitely helps. Another embossing folder that you might think about that would give you some really nice texture is the Tasteful Textile. This will also make it look like a fabric, and that one would be a good one to use as well. Once it is dry, the way I put this card together is I have a card base that is Kale Papaya. I cut this to 4 1/4 by 11, scored it at 5 1/2, right in the middle. And this is going to be an A2 card that stands like a tent. So I chose to do it that way. Obviously, it can be oriented to be an A2 card that opens like a book if you want to do that. Then there is a piece of evening evergreen that I put as my first layer. And this is cut to 4 by 5 1/4. So it's 4 by 5 1/4. It's 1/4 of an inch shorter on either side than the standard cardstock. I wanted to, or A2 card, I wanted to have a nice border around that. Then I went ahead and adhered that directly to the card. Then I have my focal point, which again is the 3 3/4 by 5. And you can see that the frames are concentric. On all sides, you have a border of 1/8 of an inch and then another border of 1/8 of an inch. Because I didn't want the middle of my design to show, since there's this kind of weird little place where the two images come together, I made a little paper ribbon to go over that middle. And I wanted to mimic the color scheme that I have for the borders. So I took a piece of scrap. This is a piece of scrap Kale Papaya. The width on this one is 1/2 inch. And I just made sure that it is a little bit bigger than the width of the card because I will be cutting it. And then I took a scrap piece of evening evergreen. Again, made sure that it was at least big enough to go across the focal point. This is cut to 1/4 inch. So the Kale Papaya is 1/2 inch. The evening evergreen is 1/4 inch. And here's how I suggest that you put that ribbon on. So you're going to have your evening evergreen piece. When you're happy with your focal point and you have gone through and you've done embossing if you want to, or whatever else you want to do, you're going to go ahead and adhere that to the evening evergreen piece. So these two pieces would go together. You will adhere the thinner of your pieces of cardstock to the one that is underneath. So in this case, I would adhere my evening evergreen to the Kale Papaya right in the middle. And then I'm going to put that onto my focal point, and I will adhere these as well. So all of this is adhered together. And then you can simply flip this over, get a pair of scissors and cut off what is hanging over the edge. And your ribbon will then be squared off against that evening evergreen frame. To finish the card, tons of ways that you can do this. And I just thought it was kind of fun to continue the play of the colors and the color combinations. And I also really like the sentiments that are included in the Hand-Penned Petals Stamp Set. There's a really cute one that is Feel Better Friend. And I thought this would be a really nice little card to send to somebody who might not be feeling well, super cheerful, very bright. And I went ahead and stamped that onto a piece of scrap basic white. This is the end result of me putting that on. So I stamped the Feel Better Friend in the evening evergreen directly onto that piece of basic white. And then I went back and I chose a couple of the stamps that I had used on the card front itself. I like the double flowers, this one. So I got that stamp set out. And I also wanted to use the small leaf and just add a couple of leaves to my image. And you can see I put one of the double flowers over the Feel Better, and then I used the leaf. And I went in and I added a couple of leaves right around. The die that I used to cut that out is from the Tasteful Labels dies. This is a really fun die set and has some really, really great images and shapes. And I used the flag die, this one right here. So I cut out my sentiment. I cut out an additional flag from a scrap piece of the Evening Evergreen. And I layered that right behind the flag that I had stamped my image and some of the additional flowers and leaves on. And then the last few things that I did to add final embellishments to this card, I used some of the gold twine, made a double bow, put one of the tails behind the flag, one of the tails in front, use some Tombow to adhere that all directly to the card. And then I did want to bling it up a little bit. And the genial gems I thought were perfect for this. They've got some really nice colors. They've got some greens and Kale Papaya, so they worked really, really well. And I just put a couple of those, used the rule of 3 to put those on the card. So that is it. And it really is, the biggest thing that I wanted to go through was the fun of using stamps and ink and water and daubers, and to just have some fun in creating a piece that you can put onto a card front. And play with this. It is something that I think the more you do it, the more you play around with it, the more you're going to like it. And I can even, this is the one that I did just a few minutes ago. After squirting the water on, I can see how some of that ink has moved, and it is just really fun and a very, very unique design. So I hope you give it a try. I think it's an awful lot of fun and just another way to work with some watercolor paper, water, and ink. So enjoy.